Good evening and welcome to the Streicker Center. I am Marjorie Schuster, coordinator of our literary events. I am so pleased this evening to welcome Professor Charles Dellheim, author and professor of history at Boston University. In conversation with Professor Dellheim will be Sylvia Freed, the editorial director at Brandeis University Press, and she holds a special interest in Jewish studies. They joined us this evening to discuss his book, Belonging and Betrayal, that tells the fascinating story of the Jewish entry into the world of European high culture. They will introduce us to a cast of characters on both sides of the Atlantic who played a pivotal role in the migration of works of art from Europe to the US, and to talk about the largest art theft in history and the question of how did the Jewish owners come to acquire this art in the first place. As always, ask your questions in the chat feature of Zoom. We will try to get to as many as we possibly can. It is now my great pleasure to welcome Charles Dellheim and Sylvia Freed.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. And thank you to the Streicker Center at Temple Emanu-El for graciously hosting this program. Gadi Levy has taken the lead in bringing to the attention of the Streicker Center and the Temple Emanu-El community Brandeis University Press publications and authors. And we're deeply grateful for that. We're grateful also to Marjorie for your wonderful introduction. Charles, we're going to jump right in. This is a subject that you and I love to talk about. So our Streicker hosts have called this program the People of the Canvas. And we took heart, we took notice of that, and we thought we would jump right in and invite you to start off with one of the most colorful characters in your book, Bernhard Berenson, who serves as serves a role to Jewish art dealers and art collectors, and also virtually epitomizes the idea in your book title, Belonging and Betrayal, the idea of yearning to belong to this cultured society. So I'm going to give you the floor and let you comment on that. Charles, we need your volume.
How about now?
There you go.
There we go. So thanks everyone for coming. Let me just start briefly with the images. On your left, you see Bernhard Berenson with his future wife, Mary Smith, who was then inconveniently married to an Irish Catholic barrister who didn't want to let her go. And this is the beginning of a torrid love affair, which is punctuated by both an intellectual partnership and mutual infidelity. He's a relatively young man at the start of his career in this picture. And on the right, we see him in older age at Villa I Tatti, his magnificent estate outside of Florence, which is filled with Renaissance painting and sculpture. So Berenson is a fascinating character for many reasons, one of which is he exemplifies a fundamental pattern of how this people of the book, traditionally focused on literary texts, become a people of the canvas. And on the one hand, this is the result of large-scale historical transformations. The emancipation of Jews, which gives them political and legal rights, their migration to urban centers, especially capital cities in Western Central Europe and in the United States, and in their acculturation. Without these things, Berenson, for all of his gifts, simply couldn't have gotten very far. Why not? Traditionally, fine art was at the symbolic heart of European high culture. It was the province of nobles, princes, churchmen, and Jews were at the margins of all of this. And Berenson is really the first major case of a Jewish figure who becomes an arbiter of taste, who authenticates paintings, who's able to establish a canon of Italian Renaissance art. And what makes this all the more extraordinary is where his story begins. He's born in a shtetl outside of Vilna in 1865, in an Orthodox home, much to the chagrin of his father, Alter, who was a bit of a free thinker. He grows up in a world in which the second commandment is taken literally: no graven images. It's a world in which, for Jews at any rate, there are virtually no visual icons. And the icons that exist were tied to the church. They were terrifying, they were frightening, they were associated with the persecution of Jews. And if Berenson had stayed in this little shtetl near Vilna, he never would have become a connoisseur. Perhaps he would have been a rabbi. So what happens? At age 10, he emigrates to America, to Boston, with his family. And his father sets out to seek his fortune, trying to parlay peddling into prosperity. And unfortunately, he fails. And it's left to Bernhard, the family genius, to succeed where his father has failed. He goes to Boston University, and then he arrives at the citadel of all proper Bostonians, Harvard. And it's at Harvard he's introduced to fine art by Charles Eliot Norton. But Charles Eliot Norton believes that art has to be seen in moral terms, and Berenson never does. Berenson is a complete outsider at Harvard. He talks unhappily, not about Anglo-Saxons, but about angry Saxons. He talks about being left on the margins. And this is a man who desperately wants to belong. And for Berenson, belonging and believing go hand in hand. So while he's at Harvard, he is converted to Christianity. He becomes an Episcopalian, a conversion that fades soon after. Why this is important is because it allows him entry into Back Bay society. He's the first Jew, let alone the first Russian Jew, to be lionized in the Back Bay. He goes off to Europe, and there he is simply overwhelmed by the art and architecture he sees. Churches, palaces, town halls, museums, galleries, scrutinizing picture after picture. And the emotional force of this, which I think would be great for most, if not all of us, is all the greater because he grew up in a world without images, and the images do overwhelm him. And what he does soon after, though not without difficulty, is to develop a method of authenticating paintings, figuring out what belongs in the canon of Italian art and what doesn't. But he also does something else. He figures out a new approach to painting, which is derived in part from a Italian politician, physician, and student of anatomy named Giovanni Morelli. So what does Berenson do? Berenson cuts the cord between seeing and believing. He doesn't emphasize the subject of a work of art as a devotional object, even in works of art that are suffused with Christian images and narratives. What he does is to emphasize their formal qualities, what he calls tactile values. And his approach is resolutely aesthetic. Art is a source of pleasure, of value, and meaning, but it's not about piety. And the reason this is so important is that what he does functionally is to make it possible for anyone, free thinker, atheist, believer, to look at a work of art with different eyes. And this always reminds me of what Philip Roth said about Irving Berlin in his novel Operation Shylock. He said that Irving Berlin turns Christmas into a holiday about snow and Easter into a holiday about hats. And Berenson functionally de-Christianizes Christian art by emphasizing aesthetics. Just one final observation on this. Berenson did not believe that Jews had any particular talent for visual art. And when he converts to Episcopalianism, and then when he converts to Catholicism, and as Mary says, both inoculations, her word, fail, he continues to see himself as a Russian and a Jew. But he's an essentialist. And as an essentialist, he believes that Jews really are people of the book. They can appreciate art, but are there great Jewish artists? He's not so sure.
Right, right. So before we move on to talk about Jews as champions of modern art, I want to turn our attention to a man who made New York his home, who you call in your book Metropolitan Man, and who we know as an august member of the Temple Emanu-El community, Benjamin Altman, someone who's known to all of us, and not only as Benjamin Altman, but Altman of the department store where all of our mothers took us to shop when we were young. So help us understand how Benjamin Altman figures in your story, and especially how he figures as the persona who helps bring art from Europe to America.
Sure. He is an amazing figure. And in October 1913, when he passes away, the funeral, which takes place at Temple Emanu-El, testifies to his accomplishments, both as an enlightened employer, as a civic-minded philanthropist, and as an art collector. And if you read the Times article about this, which I reread recently, you'll see that in the congregation were the charter members of our crowd, the great German Jewish families in New York, the Schiffs, the Warburgs, the Kahns. But there were also 1,000 employees of his who attended the service, and 5,000 people who lined the streets of Fifth Avenue in deference to him and respect to him. This is about as spectacular a send-off, if I can use an inappropriate word, as one can imagine. And it's antithetical to where he begins. He's the son of a Bavarian Jewish immigrants. His father runs a dry goods store, which was for many Jews their port of entry into American society. But the dry goods store is never very successful, and he and his brother take it over, and they don't do particularly well. But when it comes time for Benjamin Altman to take over the business, he gradually turns it into this remarkable emporium of the world's goods. This is a man who did not enjoy much in the way of formal education, but he had great intelligence. He had intellectual curiosity. He had unparalleled determination. And he also had a very slow and deliberate nature. Altman personally picked out the objects that he sold in his store, and there were hundreds, thousands of them. And there is a link between the role of Jews as valuers, whether they are valuing jewelry or valuing coins or evaluating consumer goods, between those kinds of historic skills and the kind of eye you need to be able to understand art, but to also be able to discern quality. So he begins to collect. This is his great passion. He is a bachelor. He lives a quiet life. Unlike many collectors, he does not collect to gain social status. He rarely shows his art. He's not interested in mixing with other collectors, but this is very much the centerpiece of his life. one day after work, and for him, work was many, many hours into the evening, he happens upon a small shop in lower Manhattan. And the shop is basically closed, as the owner politely tells him. And the owner is a young man named Henry Duveen, a Dutch immigrant who was a troublesome young man whose brother, Joel, the elder brother, sent him to the States to open a small gallery, also in the help of cooling off a romance that the family found inappropriate. And Altman simply tells him he'd like to buy some pottery. At the time, Henry Duveen has no idea who Altman is, and Altman has no idea who Henry Duveen is. But this begins a very important relationship. Altman and Duveen are both outsiders. They are not people who at that time would be invited to the great events of the city. Henry has a smirk on his face, a walrus mustache, a thick Dutch accent, but no one is going to mistake him for a Roosevelt or the old Dutch elite of New York. So Altman begins collecting pottery, blue and white Delft pottery, and then he gradually moves into painting. And he collects from a number of the Jewish dealers who have set up in New York, Nodlers, Gampel and Wildenstein, and the Duveens. And what's amazing about the collection is, yes, Altman had his favorites. Like many a New York merchant, he loved Dutch art, especially Rembrandt. And two of the greatest pictures in the collection are the Rembrandt's Bathsheba, who's reading a letter from King David, summoning her to him as she does her toilette, and also the portrait of Titus, Rembrandt's son. They had a special place in Altman's heart, but Altman wanted to build a private collection that had the encyclopedic range of a museum. And what you see here in his Fifth Avenue mansion is just a remarkable private museum. And what makes it all the more remarkable is at this time, the Metropolitan is not the powerhouse art institution it later becomes. It has a small and growing collection. And Altman has to figure out what he's going to do with the collection. He's had very little to do with the Met. Why not? The Met is largely a preserve of Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And the German Jews of our crowd and the Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the Morgans, the Fricks, and so forth, were people who certainly knew of each other, came into contact with each other, but they came from different worlds. But ultimately, Altman has a choice to make of what he's going to do with this extraordinary collection, a collection which represents every period, and he decides to give it to the Metropolitan. Well, on two conditions. One, that they take it in its entirety, and two, that they display it all the time. Edward Robinson, then director of the Met, meets with Altman, and he is bowled over by the offer, but he also doesn't know what to do. And he telegraphs J.P. Morgan, then on his travels in Egypt. And Morgan, who unlike Altman was not particularly deliberate, said, accept his terms on any basis. Now, the backstory for all of this is that why is all of this art available? If Altman had started collecting in, say, 1800 or in 1850, even with the same aspirations, the same skills, the same desires, he wouldn't have gotten very far. Because what happens in the late 19th century is a vast migration of old master paintings from Europe, particularly from America, which is precipitated by a financial crisis of the aristocracy and a vast sell-off. And no one uses this to greater advantage with the Duveens' help than Benjamin Altman.
Exactly. That's wonderful. Thank you. So in one of my absolutely favorite chapters, which you aptly title Madmen and Sons, you describe a scene in which Alexandre Rosenberg is walking on the street with his son, Paul, and he points out to Paul I'll read this, a very thickly painted picture with violent colors in the shop window of a gallery, which caused Paul to shriek in horror. And then you say, after calming his son, Alexandre said, I don't know this artist, and the canvas isn't signed, but I'm going to find out about him because I'd like to buy some of his work. The canvas turned out to be Room in Arles, and the artist Vincent van Gogh, who was at the time not very well known, rather largely obscure. So help us into that world of the Rosenbergs and how they become extraordinary champions of modern art. How do the Jews move into that world of modern art?
Well, they move into the world of modern art the way that they move into certain other endeavors. Modern art, like many endeavors, commercial and cultural, in which Jews congregated and in many cases excelled, was a rapidly expanding enterprise. There were ample opportunities. Barriers to entry were relatively low. It didn't require much capital to begin buying modern art in 1890 or 1900, when most of the future masters are just getting started. And that's important for Jews. It's important, too, that modern art, unlike the world of old masters, unlike the world of the academies of fine art and the salon throughout Europe, most strikingly in Paris, Jews are not part of this world. Jews have no way into this world. And they're also not particularly attached to the classical standards of history painting. That's one of the advantages of not being attached. And why Jews are able to get in is complicated. And one reason is timing again. The migration of Jews to capital cities is a phenomenon of the late 19th and early 20th century. And that coincides with the birth of modernism. There's also an openness to experimentation among Jews who are leaving Orthodoxy but have not yet found a place for themselves in the larger society in the late 19th and early 20th century. That makes them open to innovation and by and large more open. So what about the Rosenbergs? Well, Alexandra's reaction to the Van Gogh is amazing in a number of ways. He doesn't become an art dealer until 1886. He comes from Bratislava. He goes to Paris around 1873, a propitious moment when other outsiders, Charlotte Fussi, the hero of the wonderful hair with amber eyes, among them come to the city. And somehow or other, he becomes a very successful commodities broker, and he has a seat on the bourse, on the exchange. And then in 1886, he has 5 ships which rot in transit with his grain en route from Argentina, and he is wiped out. The only negotiable asset he has is his art collection, and that's where he begins. He starts trading art, decorative art, Renaissance furniture, old masters, but then very quickly works his way into 19th century French painting and then the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. And for Rosenberg and for his sons, this immersion in French culture is vitally important because it gives them all emblems of citizenship, proof of belonging. Now, how does everyone react to this purchase of the Van Gogh? Well, Madame Rosenberg, who's born Matilda Jelinek, also in the Czech and Hungarian lands, is dismayed, to say the least. She believes he's going to bankrupt them again. She tells the children he's a madman and that all their friends and neighbors will laugh when they see the Van Goghs, the Monets, the Renoirs, the Cézannes on their wall. And she was right about that, but wrong about the paintings. The Rosenbergs have 4 children, and it is decided one way or the other that the older 2, Léonce and Paul, will follow their father into the family gallery which has been located on one of the grand new streets of Haussmann's reconstructed Paris, the Avenue de l'Opéra, which leads to this great temple of neo-Baroque temple of culture. The two young men are very different. Léonce is born 1878, Paul in about 1881. They're in temperament and in looks, they're antithetical. René Gampel, himself the son of a Jewish dealer and himself a notable dealer in old masters, and also the chronicler of the transatlantic art world from World War I until 1939. Goes to school with them at the Collège Rollin, and he describes them in his diary in a very memorable way. Léonce, he says, is tall and elegant like a pink shrimp. I'm not sure any of us really want to be described as a pink shrimp, regardless of what this says about the kosher laws. Paul is lean and dark. He has high-grained cheekbones. He has the visage of a fox. And Paul turns out to be just as crafty. Léonce is idealistic, he's visionary, he's intellectual. He has a bit of a mystical streak, but he's also grandiose. He thinks he's going to be a great merchant. Paul, also an art lover, more practical, more prudent, more commercial, more canny, and more crafty. And in 1906, the father hands over the gallery to his sons. They're well prepared. They've both had significant experience in the gallery. They are both accomplished connoisseurs in their own right. And for 4 years, they work together, or more precisely, they try to work together, and it simply doesn't work. Whether it's differing temperaments or differing approaches, or simply sibling rivalry played out onto a business stage, as in many family businesses, Jewish and non-Jewish, we don't know. We do know what happens. It's decided that Paul is going to stay in the family gallery. He's going to keep selling 19th century art through the Impressionists. Léonce is going to go out on his own. And Léonce does go out on his own. And by then, he's a notable collector. He has Gauguins, Van Goghs, Cézannes, Matisses, Picassos, paintings by the Douanier, Rousseau. And then one day in 1912, he's walking along the right bank near the great church of the Madeleine, and he happens into a small street, Rue Vignon, which was easy to miss. It's still easy to miss. And there he sees an unprepossessing little gallery, and a picture in the window strikes him. It turns out to be a Van Dongen. He goes in and he meets the proprietor, a young man, maybe a couple of years younger than he is at the time, named Daniel Henri Kahnweiler, who's a German Jewish emigre. And what Léonce sees in the gallery changes his life. He becomes a devotee of Cubism. And what's remarkable about this is that just about anyone else who saw the Cubist radical subversion of ideas of mimesis and representation, the dissolving forms of a Cubist portrait, runs in the other direction or shrieks with horror, as young Paul Rosenberg did, not Léonce. And in 1914, when Kahnweiler, who doesn't want to stay in France any longer, he can't stay. He doesn't want to fight for Germany. He doesn't want to fight against Germany. He takes refuge very reluctantly in Switzerland. And by then, Kahnweiler has contracts or informal arrangements with all of the major Cubist painters, notably Picasso. And through no fault of his own, he leaves them in the lurch. And they have no independent income anymore. They have no financial stability, and they have been deprived of their great champion. And Léonce, who, like Paul, joins the French army immediately, becomes a military interpreter at the Somme, one of the bloodiest and most destructive battles of the war. He steps into the breach. And Léonce was a man in search of a mission. He wanted a sense of purpose. And he found it by championing Cubism. Well, let me leave the story at that because there's much more to it about the two brothers.
Exactly right. Leaving the story with the Rosenbergs, we're going to talk about one of the women art dealers who you focus on in the work. She's one of my favorite characters. She was recently referred to as the groundbreaking female art dealer who made a name for Picasso. Bertha Weil was doubly sidelined. She was a Jew among art dealers who had little interest or respect for Jewish art dealers. And she was a woman. And so even among the Jewish art dealers, she was also sidelined. But she was an extraordinary figure. And she promoted the work of some very major modern artists. Tell us a little bit about her.
Well, you're absolutely right. She is an extraordinary figure, and she was sidelined both by anti-Semitic prejudice and by sexist prejudice. Just one example of each. The most important dealer of her day, the man who made Cézanne's reputation, was a great bull of a man named Ambroise Vollard, who had a gallery on Rue Lafitte. And Vollard kept moving around his gallery as he became more and more successful. And unlike certain art dealers, Vollard was happier to buy than to sell. He held on to paintings. And the last gallery that he had, he decided on its location on what the rest of us would see as an extremely sexist notion. He wanted to make sure that it was across from a dress shop so that the women would go shopping while their husbands were the ones who bought the art. That's one part of the thing she has to get over. Anti-Semitism. In the mid-1890s and early 1900s, France is split apart, not unlike the way we are split apart as a country today by the Dreyfus Affair. The question of whether this hapless army captain of Jewish origin who has been framed and falsely convicted is innocent or not. And this turns into a civil war. And it's a civil war not only in the political world or in the social world that Proust describes so magnificently in Search of Lost Time, but also in the artistic world. The Impressionists split. Monet and Pissarro are Dreyfusards, Cézanne and Renoir and Degas are anti-Dreyfusards. And as it happened, the gallery that Berthe Weil opened was on Rue Victor Massé in Montmartre. And she's on the same street as Degas, who is far better off than she is. And she puts a picture in her gallery window, which a picture that extols Zola, the great defender of Dreyfus. And this sends Degas into paroxysms. He's broken with his Jewish friends, and for him, the only issue is Dreyfus. So how does this woman get there? Well, she comes from a lower middle class Jewish family, a fairly conventional one. Her mother has a certain interest in opera, and as far as Berthe is concerned, has greater interest in opera than in her daughter. Their expectations are that she is going to marry and raise a family. They give her a dowry. But as a young woman, she begins working in the bric-a-brac shop of Salvador Meyer near Rue Lafitte. And she becomes interested in antiques, but what really catches her eye is what she sees around her in Montmartre on Rue Lafitte. And what does she see around her? This is the northernmost part of Paris. It's a largely working class world. It's a world peopled by mattress makers, mill workers, fishmongers, dancers, performers, circus people, acrobats, and not least artists. And it's the artists that capture her imagination. This is the major bohemian outpost in Paris at the moment, though it's also a place that good bourgeois go for a good time, often an illicit good time. And she decides to settle there. At the beginning, she has just about no money. She has a makeshift little gallery on a nice street in the lower regions of this neighborhood. She hangs her pictures on clotheslines with clothes hooks. She stores the pictures that she can't fit in the little shop in her bedroom upstairs. But what she has is unrivaled passion. She has a meek demeanor. She's a small woman, but she says her motto is to struggle, to defend oneself. And she has to defend herself, and she has to struggle because there are so many cards against her. And also on her business card, she has another motto, place aux jeunes, give way to the young. And it's the young artists that she champions. Picasso, Matisse, Dufy, Modigliani. She gives Modigliani his one and only solo show that he has in his lifetime in 1917. And Dufy is so impressed with her phenomenal aesthetic sense that he calls her the marvel. And she becomes the dealer for almost all of these young modernist artists. She champions them. She commits herself to them, heart and soul. Unfortunately, she was not a very good businesswoman. And this was true in part because she lived from sale to sale. She had little money. Unlike Vollard, she couldn't hold on to pictures to wait until they appreciated. And what this meant for her artists is that she was able to give them only the most meager profits, which they couldn't live on. So ultimately, yes, they loved her and they left her, but there was no one they admired more. And this is memorialized in a lot of ways. A magnificent 25th anniversary costume gallery party at her gallery, and also in a wonderful little drawing that Picasso did of Berthe de Weil.
We have a few minutes left before we're going to go to questions. And I know there's so much to talk about. But I think we would be remiss without trying to focus on a figure whose story runs through as a thread, as a narrative thread through your whole book. And that, of course, is Alfred Flechtheim. His portrait graces the first page of your book, right here on the left. And on the right, I know you're going to talk about the Otto Dix portrait of Alfred Flechtheim. So let's talk for a few minutes about Flechtheim and how he's sort of the scaffold to some degree of the whole book.
He's one of my favorite characters, in part because of his intelligence, his commitment to art, but in part because of his character. He's warm, he's gregarious, he's charming, he's expansive. So expansive that he always seems like he's about to burst at the seams. A man almost always seen with a cigar in his mouth or in his hand. And when we see him on the left, which is in, I believe, 1927 or 1928, in his gallery, he is Germany's most important dealer in modern art and a man with connections all over Europe and even some in America. But where does he start? He starts as a grain dealer. He's born in the town of Munster, and he wants nothing more than to go into the family business, whose motto, if I remember correctly, is be just and shun no one. He sees grain dealing, which was a business in which many Jews, my own family included in Germany, participated in significant ways. He sees it as an honorable and dignified occupation, and he's happy to follow his father, his grandfather, his uncles. But the realities of grain dealing are not so glorious. he becomes bored very quickly. And the one saving grace of the business is travel. And he travels all over Europe, not least to Paris. And in Paris, he meets Daniel-Henri Kahnweiler, the Cubist dealer, a fellow emigre. And Kahnweiler introduces him to Picasso, who he charms with his fluent Spanish and his really perceptive comments about modern art. And the challenge for him is to find a way to free himself from the grain business. He's lucky enough to have married a woman, Betty Goldschmidt, her maiden name, from a very prosperous family. She's a smart, understanding woman, and he begins to use her considerable dowry to put together one of the few finest collections of modern art in Germany, including the best collection of Picasso's. But around the same time, the grain business is failing, it's flagging. And for Flechtheim, as for many honorable merchants, there was nothing more disgraceful than bankruptcy. And he hatches a plot to bail out his business by killing himself so that the insurance money will be used to pay off the debts. In the end, he is bailed out with some help by his friends, and by 1913, he's become an art dealer. He puts together a great exhibition in Cologne. He revitalizes a local artists association in Düsseldorf. He organizes the first great Picasso retrospective in Germany. And then the war comes, and as he says in his diary, everything is finished. He has a good war, as people used to say. He becomes an officer, fairly rare for a Jew, but his business goes under. And in 1919, with the help of the man who was then Germany's great leading modernist dealer, another Berlin Jew, Paul Cassira, he opens for business, and he opens a slew of galleries: Berlin, Düsseldorf, Frankfurt, Cologne, and partly in Vienna. And he becomes the great symbol of the Jewish art dealer and the aficionado of modernism. He is, as my former teacher, my late teacher, Peter Gay, said, he's the symbol of Weimar culture. He's the outsider as insider. But he also becomes a lightning rod for antagonism. And you see this in the Otto Dix portrait. Otto Dix was not a portraitist for the faint-hearted. He distorts everything. He exaggerates everything. But the portrait of Alfred Flechtheim is more than unusually cruel. And it's cruel in particular because Dix, who's a man of the left, uses all kinds of anti-Semitic markers: the hooded eyelids, the large nose, the large ears, the darkish skin, the furry suit, all of which give him a simian look, holding down a contract like he is a latter-day Shylock. And in the Nazi era, unsurprisingly, he is targeted as a symbol of Jewish perfidy, of the degeneracy and decadence of modern art. And in 1933, 3 days before Hitler's boycott of Jewish-owned shops is to begin, his gallery is bombed in Düsseldorf by a group of Nazi thugs who want to send a little message to this man and his colleagues. And he spends the next year looking for a way out, and he finally escapes to England, again with help from his friends, his deputy for escape, Christoph Bernoulli, if I remember his name correctly. But what happens to his art collection prefigures what happens to almost all of the people that I write about in Belonging and Betrayal. It is dispossessed. It is forcibly taken over. The term the Nazis like is Aryanization, but Aryanization is one of those weasel words which cover up the reality of systematic, organized theft.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you. There's lots more we can talk about, and there's lots more I urge people to look for in your book. But now I'm going to hand it off to Marjorie, who's has been collecting some wonderful, wonderful questions from the audience. So
Great.
thank you.
I do want to thank both of you because I think we could listen to you all evening because it's a fascinating topic. So I'll start with a comment from Lori, who says, marvelous program. This topic is fascinating. I look forward to reading the book. Please come again. That's very nice. So now we'll get to the questions. Naomi would like you to discuss a little bit more about the betrayal aspect described in your book.
Yes, absolutely. I think that in one of my first meetings with my wonderful editor, Sylvia, she said to me, I think you have betrayal on the brain. And as the son of German Jewish refugees, I suppose I come by it honestly. But this is not my story. It's not an autobiography or a memoir, it's a history. So let me talk about what betrayal means. The great promise of assimilation, acculturation, emancipation, whatever term you want to use, runs something like this. Adopt our language, adopt our customs, discard signs of difference, learn our ways, and we will accept you more or less. Now, in fact, the acceptance was gradual, it was piecemeal. It was strong at times and weak at others. Anti-Semitism was a given. Sometimes it spiked, sometimes it went underground to an extent. But what emancipation is about, what acculturation is about, is essentially a social contract. If you do these things, if you become more like us, you will be respectable. You will almost be like one of us. But the problem is that in many ways, this social contract is broken. Not everywhere, not every time, certainly not in the heart of every individual or group. But what's the betrayal about? John le Carré says in one of his novels, It May Be a Perfect Spy, that there is no betrayal without love. And what we see in the story that I tell is Jews see art, in Heinrich Heine's famous phrase, as a passport to civilization. It is their way into a society in which they have been outsiders for centuries, objects of derision, objects of persecution. And this immersion in art, the immersion in literature, the immersion in the intellectual and aesthetic traditions of European society and of different European countries is a way in which Jews thought they were really becoming European. In Stefan Zweig's very moving memoir, which is published immediately after he has taken his own life in Brazil, there's a very memorable line in the beginning, and he says that Jews became truly Viennese through their cultural activities in theater, in art, in music, and in literature. That was their way in. But by these incursions into territory that previously had been dominated by non-Jews, they become visible, and with visibility, they become vulnerable. What right did these people, who were aliens, after all, in the eyes of anti-Semites, what right did they have to take any role whatsoever in these activities? So first we see a cruel backlash for competitors in the 1920s. Can Jews ever really be French? Can they ever be German? Or are they always going to be outsiders? And then we see the violent onslaught from the Nazis, and that is the great betrayal. The Nazi idea that Jews had no right to own art. They had no right to participate in the cultural world. And that they stripped them of their citizenship, they stripped them of their art. along with their sacred books and objects, along with their money, their gold, their rare manuscripts, everything in their houses. Because what the Nazis assumed was the Jews were Untermenschen, they were inferiors, they were materialists who could possess but never appreciate beauty, and that they had gained their art by ill-gotten means, by some sort of thievery. Now, this is all a fantasy, but that doesn't make it any less venomous and any less powerful. So the betrayal is that the very people who have dedicated themselves to the cause of European art and culture in their own lives as dealers, as collectors, as critics, as connoisseurs, as historians, and not least as artists, these people are targeted by the Nazis. And what follows, as we know, is a unprecedented theft and murder.
Wow. Well, that leads us into two more questions, one by, I want to get this right, one by Amy and one by Wesley, and they're pretty similar. Were the artists ever reluctant to sell to the Jews or Jewish dealers? And the second part of that question is, would you just discuss the relations between Jewish art dealers and artists who are Jewish?
Sure. Those are both really interesting questions. So were artists reluctant to sell to Jews? So let me start with a story from Henry Duveen. Henry Duveen, who had been the troublesome young brother, became a very powerful dealer in New York, the dealer for Frick and Morgan and Huntington, as well as Benjamin Altman. And when he told his imperious and ambitious nephew, Joe, one day about how to run the art business, he said, "We got the goods." And that is, if you want Rembrandt's Bathsheba and Henry Duveen owns it, sure, go down the street, go to another city, try to get another Rembrandt, but you're dealing with unique, irreproducible objects. In that sense, it's not like grain. It's not like you could buy grain from Michel Fribourg, or you could buy grain from a non-Jewish dealer. But the grain's a commodity. Art is a commodity in the sense that it's bought and sold on the market, but it's also a symbolic good with what the great German cultural critic Walter Benjamin called a unique, irreproducible aura. So artists and dealers, well, it's a fascinating subject. Let me give you just a couple of examples. In 1900, Gaston and Jos Bernheim Jeune, who inherit their father's gallery and take it one step further by turning it into a gallery dedicated to modern art. They're 30 years old and they become engaged to two sisters, the sisters Adler. And the sisters Adler are eligible, presentable, intelligent young Jewish women from a bourgeois family not unlike their own. And they want to commemorate their engagements as art dealers and as dealers in modern art with portraits. And who was the natural choice? Renoir. Renoir loved painting young girls and young women. He much preferred that to painting men. And the brothers go to Renoir to ask him to paint their fiancée's picture. Now, you think this is very straightforward. A commission is a commission is a commission. But it wasn't quite that straightforward. The brothers Bernheim were Dreyfusards. They, in fact, had driven Zola in their the very fancy and technologically modern car that they were very proud of to his hearing at the Palais de Justice. So they were partisans of the Republic. They were people who believed in careers open to talent, into a secular world. And what about Renoir? Well, Renoir was very anti-Semitic. He calls Jews cowards and shirkers. He has no respect for them. He's certain that Dreyfus was guilty, which he was not. Would they work together? Yes, they did work together. Why? Well, anti-Semitism was a given in this world. Was it universally shared? Well, fortunately not, but it was there. And if the Bernheims were going to be clearing the collectors who came into their gallery to make sure that none of them were anti-Semites, well, they would have been losing out on a lot of business. And much the same applies to Renoir. Renoir lived by commissions. By 1900, he was fairly well off. He was fairly prosperous, but it was advantageous for him to deal with the Bernheims. So whatever suspicions they had of each other, they do deal with each other. And Renoir goes to the Adler's house, and he stays there, lives there for 10 days. And when he comes out, he is just entranced by these young women. And he paints very beautiful, appealing portraits of them. But the relationship doesn't end there. Renoir becomes the family portraitist for the Bernheims. He paints portrait after portrait of the family. Does this mean that Renoir stops being anti-Semitic? Unfortunately, it doesn't. It means that he reaches an accommodation with the Bernheims, that either for reasons of expediency or for genuine affection, and I think it was a little bit both, these people find an accommodation. But there are also artists who are real philo-Semites. I know that's a problematic term to many, but relatively speaking, it fits. And this is a story that also deals with the Bernheims and with their cousin, Jos Hessel, who was the longtime manager of their gallery. Vuillard comes from a very modest background in Paris, but he goes to a very fancy school, the Lycée Condorcet, which is also a school which is very hospitable to the sons of liberal, bourgeois, newly prosperous Jews. And Vuillard becomes very comfortable in these circles. And almost all of his patrons are Jews. Tadej Nathanson, who with his brother is the founder of the Revue Blanche, the White Review, one of the major organs of avant-garde art and literature, is his first patron. Vuillard, who never married but fell in love often, and almost always with married women, fell in love with Nathanson's wife. And then he ultimately, around 1900, he's allied to the Bernheims. And the man who is in charge of his career is Hessel. Hessel has very advanced taste. He's very shrewd. He also had a gambling habit, which meant that he would gamble away paintings, including Van Gogh's. And Vuillard becomes entranced by the world of the Hessels. And in his diaries, he compares himself rather grandiloquently to Rembrandt. And he says he too painted only Jews. Now, that was a favorite myth about Rembrandt. And it goes back to the idea that in Breestraat and the street he lived in during his glory days in Amsterdam, he did have many Jewish painters. And then there was the great painting of the Jewish bride, which is the basis for the myth, correctly or not. But he also has there's a really erotic element in all of this. Vuillard writes about these beautiful Jewesses with their shimmering silks. And none was more important to him than Hessel's wife, Lucy Hessel, who was very intelligent, very maternal, who took good care of Vuillard, who lived at home with his mother until he was 40 and she passed away. So this is an example of someone who's very comfortable in Jewish circles. What about a Jewish dealer and a Jewish artist? Let me give an example of an artist very briefly who wasn't well known. Abraham Minchin comes to Paris after the war, Russian Jewish emigre, and is forever chasing his older compatriot Chaim Soutine, who's by then better established, a charter member of the École de Paris, these Jewish painters who congregate in Montparnasse, a friend of Picasso's. And Minchin is ultimately taken up by René Gampel, the Rosenberg's school friend, who was basically a dealer in old masters, but who sometimes sold Picasso's and Matisse's to American museums. And well before Gampel meets Minchin, he's convinced he's a genius, and he begins buying his pictures. And when they meet, he's very taken with him. Minchin has a quality of innocence despite all of his intelligence and ambition. And Gampel really becomes his tutor. He takes him to museum after museum. He comments on his work when it's getting better, when he's falling back. And Minchin is full of aspiration, full of spiritual longing and aesthetic ambition. But he's also very ill. And he does without food so he can feed his wife and his infant daughter. And there's this deeply poignant, moving picture of this young man in a suit who is beaming at his daughter. But the way this story really plays out is symbolized by probably my favorite photograph in the book, which is Minchin on a bridge in Paris, a wooden bridge, smiling, wearing a suit, elegantly dressed with his arms out. And he's in the middle of the bridge and he's crossing that bridge. And that bridge is really the bridge of belonging. When a Russian Jewish painter is able to cross the bridge to become part of French culture. And he has no way of knowing that what's on the other side of that bridge is not belonging, but betrayal.
Wow, very powerful. I would like to ask you all these questions. I wish we had time because we've got 16 questions more, which obviously we cannot do. We will get cut off. But the very last question, two people are a little bit interested in Berenson, Muriel and Bob. Muriel said her book club read The Personal Librarian, which Berenson is described. Is it true that he denied being Jewish? Later, he was outed as a fraud. Is that accurate?
So Berenson's relationship to Jews and Judaism is very, very complicated. And I discuss it extensively in the book. So on the one hand, he converts to Episcopalianism, then he converts to Catholicism, but then he really loses faith in both. But all the while, he sees himself as a Russian and a Jew. And this is how he writes about himself to Mary when their love affair begins. It's also how other people see him. Henry Adams, the great scion of the Adams family, a Boston Brahmin, if ever there was one, the author of The Education of Henry Adams, is very fond of Berenson, but there's always a sticking point in their relationship because Berenson says he could never forget that he was an Adams, and I could never forget that I was a Jew. Jews and Judaism are a theme that run through Berenson's life, and there are instances of self-hatred and self-denial when he is trying to fit in, and assimilating art and the art of assimilation are very closely tied together. But Berenson was a Jew, and he was very conscious of that. And there was no doubt that he was particularly conscious of this with the rise of fascism, when Jewish friends of his, like Dora Levy, professor of art history in the Italian university, are visiting Itati, and he receives a letter saying that he's been dismissed from his professorship. After the war, Berenson writes very eloquently about Jews and Judaism in almost all of his writings, but mostly in his diaries. So it's a very complicated question and a compelling one.
First of all, Sylvia, can you please turn your camera back on so we can thank you? There you are. First of all, I want to thank both of you. The comments keep coming in, and I think the best comment was someone said they wish they were an art history major if they could do it all over again, because it really is it's a fascinating topic. I want to thank both of you. You're both so knowledgeable, and we could sit here all night. Like I said, there are 15 new messages now. Maybe we'll write them down and try to send some to you. So
it would be great. I'd love that.
Yeah, because there are a lot of questions that we would like a few answers to. So thank you very much, Charles. Thank you very much, Sylvia. And thank you, everybody, for watching. And please join us again at all our future events at the Streicker Center. And good evening.
Thank you very much, Marjorie.
Thanks,
Good night,
everyone.
Charles.